Alright, in this tutorial I want to cover something that goes more into the area of digital photo enhancing or editing to perhaps remove some blemishes or some scars or pimples and other items you might not want. Tough one here, the white hair. That's well, we could do that too, maybe in another tutorial. This one here, what I'm going to focus on is a part of this area here where there is a scar showing, and then also a pimple or sort of a small mole. And what we want to do is see a couple of techniques to remove those, or to cover them up, or to blur them, to make them a little bit less visible. So here's the first technique, and the way I will do this is not on a single image, but I want to show that actually over the entire image sequence. So this is from a video clip. It's only about 3 or 4 seconds long. You can see it has 101 frames, so when playing at 30 frames per second, it's going to be barely 4, like 3.5 seconds. And you can see, we can definitely see this little blemish here, and we'd like to perhaps find a way to cover that up. So let's first see what we will cover it up with. One thing that we can do is simply grab a little bit of the skin next to it. Similar lighting, similar appearance, similar, let's say if there are some small hair, or maybe some folds or some other little details that we don't want to suddenly see disappear. So I mean, one thing that we don't want to do is, let's say, pick the whole thing and then just blur it, right? If I look at the alpha overlay being disabled and we see the marching ants, you could go and simply blur right in this area, maybe with the Gaussian blur. But when you do that, it looks kind of odd. You have you still see a lot of little details that your skin does have. You know, some of them are blemishes or scars, but others are just regular little imperfections that make it perfect. That's the real skin, and it just looks too much like a porcelain doll when you have something like this. You don't want that. Now, you might occasionally want to go just blur it somewhat, but the better approach perhaps is to actually go and cover it up with something just nearby. So there are a couple of techniques, and one of them is really manually doing that. I would start with the magic one, not the magic wand here, the lasso selection tool, lasso to alpha, and simply kind of contain the area, kind of get a visual of what we want to cover up, and then perhaps find an area nearby similar size or even a little bit bigger. So if you see this, what you can actually use is the control key and then drag this sideways. That will move the selection mask around, so you can move that to make it the same, and then perhaps say, well, okay, we don't need to have it exactly. What do I have here? Oh, Java update. Get out. Alright, so we don't need to do the update on Java right now. Alright, so I'm going to select a slightly larger area here, and the reason is that I want to also blur it somewhat. So I'm going to go to the selection menu and then blur, and it's actually easier to see the blurriness on the selection edge if I switch to the alpha overlay here. So you see the very crisp selection right now. And I'm going to first of all store the alpha just to get a little snapshot of what that looks like right now. It's a crisp selection, and what I'll do next is to blur it with the Gaussian blur or box filter. I think the Gaussian blur will be fine, and then adjust that a little bit, and you can see how now that selection is a transition that gets kind of blurry and not a very crisp one. Don't give it too much, but also not too little. You do want to give it, you know, about this much here. And at that point, you can simply, after you apply that, you can simply pick this up as a custom brush. You can do that right here from the brush menu and select it like that. Or you can use the custom brush selector tool, but it's always a bit difficult to know exactly how far out you need to go there to cover it. But still, that will work too. You can grab it about this much is probably a safe bet. All right, if you do that with the brush menu, you will do that just going to the containing bounding box, and then it clears the alpha, and you can store the brush, and that's the one I have right here. I had done this a little bit earlier. Let's clear this. We don't need this one anymore. So here's transparent edges all around it, and then kind of on the inside it's fully opaque with a nice soft transition. So if I pick this brush to paint with it and I make it preview so I can see it, you can see I can place it right over here, and you can barely see that it's there because the edge is not a crisp on or off transition. It's soft, and you can see that it's soft. If, for instance, you go over some other areas with very different brightness, you can see that the hair doesn't just suddenly disappear. It's just gradually showing the skin on top here. So that's in the brush with a progressive transparency, and you could use that to simply cover up areas, just painting right over it, little dabs. Click the cursor once or twice, and you can see here that the scar goes away. You don't want to drag it around, although that could also be okay sometimes, and then you can place it right over that initial pimple we want to cover anyway. Now let me undo that a few times until I go back to the original, or I'm going to restore, because I stored the animation here. I did store it, so I'm going to restore the one that has the original. There you go, just so we can start with that again. And what I'd like to do really is show now how we can make it appear all over the frame sequence, and not just this one and not just the next one, but really all of them. So one thing you could do obviously is just manually do that, right? If you have only about 100 frames, it doesn't take that long to do so. But it could introduce a little bit of jitters or some other noise frame by frame when you play it back, where you might notice that some of these pimples that are, or the skin details, might actually be kind of moving. Oh, I used the right button here. Let me undo that. If you go from one frame to the other, they might appear like they're moving a little bit, because if you're going manually there, it's not going to be easy to make it go perfectly in place. So what you will want to do is like kind of go right there, click it, and then go to the next frame and click it. And you may need to get focus again. Click it twice then, I guess, if the first time it loses the focus. And then you see it, and then I think you can also use the arrow keys left and right. Yep, and that can also help. The other thing that might sometimes be useful, let me see if I can go to one. There you go. Click it. Yeah, and then see, it loses the keyboard focus. So it's not the best, and it's also going to have a little bit of noise here. You can probably see here that it's not always in the perfect place. See, for instance, these two frames here. See how the thing appears to be swimming away from the rest of the texture? That's because, you know, no matter how precisely you aim it, it's going to be tough to have it exactly at the right pixel location. Manually is perhaps not the best way to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is use a motion tracker to find where this thing is moving frame by frame. Right? When you think about it, if you could put a little tracker on it here and find its location for each frame as it goes across it, then all we got to do is say, well, go place it right there as it tracks it. And so that's actually something we can do quite easily with the Brush Keyframer. So we need, for the Brush Keyframer, we need an image that contains the brush contains. So this image is that piece of the skin that we have identified, that we want to use in place here after we identified the movement of it. So we need to use the Brush Keyframer from the animation menu right there. And the Brush Keyframer will basically kind of open like a plugin in its own little window to preview. And when you think about it, this is all we need to do. We need to have it show a let me go clear the path. There you go, because I did that a few minutes ago. So I want to start from scratch here, and it shows actually here in the middle. It shows the currently loaded brush, which is a little bit lighter here. Over here will be perfect, but over here the skin is already a little bit darker. So if we move it around, you can see that's not where we want it. Where we want it is right here. And so what I would do is simply click it, right? Place the cursor exactly where you want it, and then click, and maybe you need to move it a little bit, and that will place it right there, and that's our first keyframe. We need to set 2 keyframes before we go here to say track the brush. Right. The next thing we need to do is to say where it's going to have to be at the end. At the beginning it's here and it covers it up just nicely, but at the end it doesn't, because there's a little jump to the upper and then sideways. We turn the head and you can see now the brush stayed back here, so we need to say no, Mr. Brush here, or Mrs. Brush, I don't know, what is the gender of a brush? Let's place the brush over here and keyframe that. And make sure, yeah, this was the last frame of the sequence. So you can see now we have a line, a dotted line here that shows which way the movement of the brush is going to be. It's okay here, but then somewhere here it's not. It's off because we jump back up, down, and so obviously sometimes you'll have very similar movement that is almost perfectly lined up, but sometimes it goes up and down, and it's just really a difficult one to track manually, because you could do that manually too. You could say, okay, for this particular frame I want it here, keyframe that, go to the next one, and so on. Easier though if you let the system try to figure it out by tracking it. So what you do is you set the initial position and you set the end position for the first frame and for the last frame respectively. And then you say, okay, given that, go to the first frame and then go to track brush. The brush is here and it has to end up over there. It needs to track something as it's going from here to there, and that something that's going to track is the image that is behind the brush, right? If the brush wasn't there, you would actually see this thing, and so it's going to look at that and track it. That's exactly what that motion tracker is going to do. And so click on the track brush, and now there's one more, 2 or 3 more parameters you can enter here. One is the block size and the search area. So what you want to do is imagine, you see it actually up here, it's kind of an odd place to put it, but it's up there in the upper left corner. You can set the size of the block that it's looking for to track, and then you have the size of the search area, which is how far to look for it. Now here it's actually showing it in the upper left corner. It's really only showing you a quadrant. I don't know why it's up there. I thought it should be in the middle there somewhere, but it doesn't matter anyway. You can see roughly the size of it, and it's going to be twice as big up and down and sideways. Okay, so that's a little light cyan, light blue color, and that's the area that we want to track. It doesn't have to be much bigger or much smaller than the pimple, but it could. We could have it actually contain a few items of detail, but just as long as it's unique, just as long as it doesn't look similar to something nearby, right? You don't want to track something that looks identical to another item nearby, because it's going to jump, it's going to lose it or track something else. What you want to do is give it enough space to look for something that's unique, and then also the search area. Don't go too far, but far enough that if there is a sudden big movement, it doesn't lose it. You want to be able to track it, right? And if you don't allow it to search far enough, well, then it's not going to be able to track it. All right, so that's basically the trick with that. Is the motion tracker is going to start at the initial position, it's going to end at the end position, and in between it's going to try to track whatever the image is inside this little light green here, but placed at that position. There are a few more options here, and there is something about the motion tracker just explaining here the same thing. And there is also use previous frames as reference. So that's another thing too, is that you can use this frame only for reference. That is something that sometimes helps, but sometimes you want to say no, progressively use one frame to the next, use the previous one as a reference, right? So that's the default here, and I'm going to try with that right now. So watch what happens. I'm going to click track, and so it's now looking for that, and you can see where it's going and gradually grabbing it, and it seems to be tracking it just fine. Now at some point it doesn't do the updating, but it's still doing the calculations. Don't worry, just wait for it to finish. So when you see this thing and it seems like not responding, I said, well, yeah, hey, I'm busy. I'm not going to respond right now. It's quite intensive in terms of the calculations to do this motion tracking business, and it's thinking, hey, you do that if you think that's easy, right? Anyway, so here we go, and we've just done this. Now you can see a little dotted line. That's not just a straight line anymore as it used to be when I initially set the start and the finish. It's now actually going up because we have that initial jump, and then we go sideways and a little wiggly and then down and so on. And that's exactly what we needed. Now you see at the bottom, each position, each frame has a little tick mark because that's how many position it created. It created a path, a motion path for the brush to go along. And no matter where you look, you will not see the blemish anymore. It's being hidden by our brush that we placed there. That brush happens to be that original copy of a nearby piece of the skin. So luckily it doesn't change hue or brightness or color too much, and it's very usable for this quick fix. The thing could be, though, sometimes you want to put something else there, right? Something totally different, maybe you have a circle and you want to put a square there or something like that. So you can really use it with in a lot of other ways. The image itself, the brush, in fact, can even be animated. It can be an animated brush. So you could put a little movie clip there, right? And what we want to do, though, in this case is simply cover it up. So let's go render that, and that is basically mission accomplished. Boom, done. Yep. Okay, so now we can close this and look at the modified version of our clip. We don't need the preview of the brush anymore. Let's turn PRV off, and there we are. Now we have a much different, much nicer looking, I might say, and add skin appearance there. There still is something else to work on, and that's the kind of a scar. We had some injury here. You can see where it went like this, and there were some stitches, and you can see where the traces are left from the stitching. And so we'll cover that in the next tutorial, but that's already a nice start here. We can see if we play it, it's very difficult to see anything abnormal, unusual, or touched up. It just appears really nice, and that's what this is all about. Let's go back and see it one more time in the original. I'm clicking here to restore that. Right there, you see this little dark spot right there. See how it moves? That is on the video. That is on the original skin. And now we'll click a stored copy of the fixed one. Not the one I just did, but one I did a little bit earlier. Exactly same technique. And there you go. Alright, so that's one technique to fix something like a pimple or a blemish of some sort. This will work if you have a clip that is maybe 5 or 10 seconds long. Obviously you cannot put all of this in memory if you have a 32-bit application there. I mean, if it goes into tons of gigabytes of RAM, it's not going to work this way. But what you can do if you have, let's say, what's this one, about 4 seconds long at 30 frames, 110, not even 120, 101 frames. Each frame is full HD, because if I show it at 100% size here, that's the full size, that's the original size. Right? So you can see that this is quite nicely doable. And keep an eye on the task manager if you need to see whether you're close to running out of RAM. Also, whenever you store it like this here. Don't store it in memory, but store it on disk. Then that way you'll have an easier, you'll have more memory still available to do the job that where these frames have to be staying in memory. Alright, well, so thanks for watching this tutorial. We'll have a few more on this topic. Next one will be kind of a bigger area, and we will actually put multiple motion trackers to kind of follow the shape. The shape could be changing. It's not moving here anymore, luckily, but imagine if it did. If you had an object that actually changes the shape and you want to track its shape, you're going to need more than what we did, where we had just one motion tracker on that one blemish, on that one mole. You would actually need a bunch of motion trackers approximating the curve of the outline that you want to track, and we can do that too. In fact, for instance, the eyes, if the eyes close as she's blinking, look at that, see right there, right? There is a place where you need to squeeze it and then reopen it. If, for instance, you wanted her eyes to turn brown, from brown to blue, you could do that. In fact, you could have it brown here, close the eyes and reopen them to blue. That would be an interesting exercise. All right, but she's still moving, so after they're open we still need to track it, and that's exactly what we'll do with the motion tracker. And there'll be multiple motion trackers along the curve that identify the outline. So we'll see how that works, and that we understand how it works for just one motion tracker in the first place, and how we can force the rendering of a brush at that location, centered on that location. We'll do something similar, maybe more with a fill procedure, like to fill through the alpha channel of the motion tracked shape outline, or perhaps to blur it if that's all it takes to make it disappear. There's so many different ways really to implement it. All right, thanks for watching.